Chapter 11 of Puss in Boots, Jr. in Fairyland. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Shasta, Oakland, California. Puss in Boots, Jr. in Fairyland by David Corey. Thunder Voice. One day, Puss, Jr. came to a high mountain, and as he was tired and thirsty, he looked about him for a place to rest and something to drink, and in a few minutes he spied a little spring gushing right out of a rock, and close by, not a foot away, sat a little fairy dressed in green. "I am the spirit of the water," she cried, waving a silver wand in the air. "May I take a drink from your spring?" asked Puss, Jr. politely, but he didn't drink a drop, for he was afraid he might not like it. "Of course you may," she replied, "but only one goblet full," and she handed him a beautiful crystal glass. And as soon as he had tasted the water, his weariness left him and he felt refreshed. "Now," said the little fairy, "don't you climb up that mountain, for on the top lives a giant whose name is Thunder Voice, and he'll scare you to death and may deafen you." "Never fear, my kind little fairy," answered the little hero. "I once met the giant of the beanstalk, so why should I fear the giant of the mountain?" And he bowed to the fairy of the spring and started up the mountain. And by he heard a dreadful noise. The mountain shook and trembled, and the air rushed by like a hurricane, and the trees bent and the grasses shivered, and great pieces of rock tumbled down into the valley below. "I guess old Thunder Voice is talking to himself," said the little hero with a laugh, "which shows he wasn't afraid, doesn't it?" And then who should come in sight but the giant himself, and he was so tall and big that Puss couldn't see the top of his head, and neither could the giant unless he looked in his wife's mirror. "Where did you come from, kitten?" asked the dreadful big man in a thunderous tone, which almost blew off Puss Jr.'s hat. "I am Puss in Boots, Jr., and you can't frighten me." "Rum, rum, dum, dum," yelled the giant, and the feather on little Pussy Cat's hat blew off and drifted down the wind until it caught on a fir tree. "How dare you speak to me like that? No one ever did before and lived to tell the tale." And he rushed at Puss and tried to catch him, but Puss darted to one side and drew his sword, and when the giant saw that, he laughed again and said, "You are a brave little cat. Come to my castle, and I promise you no harm shall befall you." So Puss went with him, and when they entered the giant's home, a little gray dove flew out and lighted on his shoulder and cooed, and the big giant stroked its pretty feathers so softly that Puss thought to himself, "This giant can't be so very wicked after all if he loves that little bird." And he wasn't the least bit afraid, but sat down on a chair while the giant hung up his great cap on a wooden peg and wound the clock. And in the next story you shall hear more about Puss Jr. at the giant's castle. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of Puss in Boots, Jr. in Fairyland. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Shasta, Oakland, California. Puss in Boots, Jr. in Fairyland by David Corey. Puss relates an adventure. In the story before this, I left Puss, Jr. in the giant's castle, you'll remember, and I'll tell you right now I hated to do it. And if that dear little yellow bird hadn't told me that the giant was really a very kind man, I should have been worried to death. "Now, what will you have to eat, kitten?" asked the giant with a grin. "Give me a saucer of cream and a piece of fish," said Puss, and he curled his whiskers and flicked a piece of dust off his red-topped boots, as if he had always been used to dining with giants and other big people. And after supper, the giant took out his great pipe and smoked until the air was so cloudy that the little dove couldn't be seen at all. And after a little while, Puss stroked his whiskers and crossed his leg, and then he commenced to tell one of his adventures. Once upon a time there was a little cat who lived in a big white house, and one day he went into the garret, and the first thing he saw was a storybook. It was a very pretty storybook, and on the cover was a picture of a cat with red-topped boots, and the name of the book was Puss in Boots. Well, as soon as this little cat saw the picture on the cover, he said to himself, "That must be the portrait of my father, for the picture looks very much like me." So he hunted around, and would you believe it? He found a pair of boots with red tops and a cane and a hat with a long feather in it. So off he started to find his father, for he said to himself, "If I look just like the picture on the cover, why, it will be possible for me to find the original of that portrait. And if it turns out to be my father, how happy I shall be." So off he went down the road, and by he met some Mother Goose friends. You see, he was in Mother Goose country, but at first he didn't know it. There was the old woman who lived in a shoe, and the jolly miller who caught a flea upon his pillow, and old Mother Hubbard and her dog, and little Bo Peep, and the cow that jumped over the moon, and so many more that I can't tell them to you now, for if I did, my story would never end. Well, by and by, after a little while, he came to a town where Wee Willie Winkle put the children to sleep, and it was just about dusk as this little cat entered the city, and the first thing he saw was a small boy in his nightdress running through the streets with a candle in his hand. So the little cat followed him, and pretty soon Wee Willie Winkle ran up the steps in front of a pretty cottage and peeked through the keyhole, and then he began to sing: "Time for bed, it's 8, oh Peep, jump in bed and go to sleep. Willie Winkle's at the door, he won't wait a minute more. Close your eyes and dream away, you've been playing all the day." And then Wee Willie Winkle ran down the street to another house where there were more little boys and girls. As Puss finished his story, he looked up, and goodness me, the giant was snoring. So Puss curled himself up and was soon fast asleep. And if he wakes up in time tomorrow, I'll tell you another story about him. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Puss in Boots, Jr. in Fairyland. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Shasta, Oakland, California. Puss in Boots, Jr. in Fairyland by David Corey. Dickory, dickory, dare. You remember in the last story, I left Puss fast asleep in the giant's house. Well, the next morning he said goodbye and went merrily on his way, hoping for a new adventure. And when he had gone only a short distance, whom should he meet but Mother Goose and her gander? And wasn't he glad to see the dear old lady again? "You're just in time to take a sky ride with me," she said. And then Puss jumped up behind her and the gander flew away, and by they met a small pig tied by his tail to a big red balloon. And oh dear me, how that little pig was squeaking! And then all of a sudden, hickory dickory dare, the pig flew up in the air. The man in brown soon brought him down. Dickory dickory dare. Yes, sir, the man in brown fitted an arrow to his bow and punctured a great hole in the red balloon. And then, of course, it came tumbling down, and so did the little pig. And wasn't it lucky that there was a big haystack for him to fall into? Well, I guess it was, for if there hadn't been there would be nothing more to write about Piggy except his epitaph. "Who tied that poor pig to the balloon?" asked Mother Goose, for by this time the gander had come down to the meadow with his two passengers. "I think it was Tommy Green," answered the man in brown. "I don't like cruel boys," said Mother Goose. "They generally grow up to be bad men." "That's true," said the man in brown, taking off his cap and scratching his head reflectively. "And isn't he the Tommy Green who drowned the poor pussycat in the well?" "I think he is," answered the man in brown. And when Tommy Green heard this, he started to run away. "Stop! Stop!" cried Mother Goose. "Why did you tie that little pig to your balloon?" "I just wanted to see him fly," answered Tommy Green, and he twisted about uneasily, for Mother Goose scowled. Oh my, didn't she scowl at him! "Supposing a big giant had tied you to a monstrous kite," said the man in brown to Tommy Green, "how would you have liked it?" And then he pinched that bad boy's ear to make him remember what he said. "Will you promise to treat all animals kindly hereafter?" said Mother Goose. "Yes, ma'am," said naughty Tommy Green. "Then run home and tell your mother that you met Mother Goose today and that she gave you a good scolding for being cruel to a little pig." And in the next story you shall hear how Mother Goose and Puss, Jr. went home with the man in brown. End of chapter 13.
Chapter 14 of Puss in Boots Jr. in Fairyland. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Puss in Boots Jr. in Fairyland by David Corey. Lullabies. Well, after the bad boy who had tied the little pig to his balloon had promised Mother Goose to be kind to all animals in the future, the gander, who hadn't spoken a word all this time, said to the dear old lady, "I feel very tired. I don't think I can fly another mile tonight." "Come home with me," said the man in brown. "I have a cozy house, and my wife is a good cook. There is enough and to spare for us all." So Mother Goose, Puss Jr., and the tired gander followed the man in brown, and by they came to a neat-looking little house. "Do you hear her singing?" he asked, and he opened the little white gate very carefully. "Sleep, baby, sleep, our cottage vale is deep. The little lamb is on the green, with woolly fleece so soft and clean. Sleep, baby, sleep." "My good woman is putting the baby to sleep," said the man in brown. "She sings that self-same song to him every evening, and he always goes to sleep. Sleep, baby, sleep, down where the woodbines creep. Be always like the lamb so mild, a kind and sweet and gentle child. Sleep, baby, sleep." "Shh," said the man in brown, tiptoeing up the steps of the little front porch, over which the honeysuckle trailed its perfumed flowers. "Tiptoe so as not to wake the baby." So Puss Jr. slipped off his red-top boots, and Mother Goose walked softly on her toes, and the gander waddled as gently as he could on his big, flat, pink feet. And while they all crept quietly through the hall to the kitchen, the sweet voice became lower and lower. "Be always like the lamb so mild, a kind and sweet and gentle child. Sleep, baby, sleep." The kettle on the kitchen stove was singing its own sweet song, and the canary bird in his gold cage whistled softly now and then. "Be seated," said the man in brown. "My good woman will be here shortly, for when her voice grows soft and low, I know the baby has fallen asleep." And of course he knew, for in a few minutes the good woman came tiptoeing into the room. "I wish you'd only come sooner, so that my little one could have met you, dear Mother Goose," she said, and then she turned to Puss, who was sitting on a chair with his right leg crossed over his left knee. "And here is dear Puss Jr. We have a storybook all about his father, the famous Puss in Boots." And then she picked up our little traveler and held him on her lap and sang oh so softly, "Sleep, little pussycat, sleep. Let the little mouse creep. Sleep, little pussycat, sleep." End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of Puss in Boots Jr. in Fairyland. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Puss in Boots Jr. in Fairyland by David Corey. Dapple Gray. When Puss woke up the next morning, Mother Goose had already flown away on her gander. So he started off on foot, and by he came to a place where the road turned to the right and to the left at the same time. Wasn't that queer? And one sign said to Raspberryville, and the other to Lollipop Town. And while he stood wondering which way to turn, a little rocking horse whose name was Dapple Gray came up the road, and when he saw Puss Jr., he said, "I'm a little rocking horse whose name is Dapple Gray, so jump into my saddle and ride a mile away. You need not use a whip or lash, for I will go so fast you'll think you're on a train of cars that whiz the stations past." And of course Puss jumped right into the saddle and rode off down the road to the right until they came to a bridge where the tollman charged him a penny to cross. "Why do you charge a penny?" asked Puss. "It seems to me a farthing is enough." But the tollman said no, and so Puss took out a penny. I suppose they charged a penny because he was riding Dapple Gray. Don't you think so? Well, by, after they had gone for maybe a mile or more, they came to an old gander who was standing near the road, quacking like a steam radiator out of order. "Goosey, goosey, gander, why do you quack?" asked Puss, pulling up Dapple Gray until he stood on his hind legs and pawed the air with his front hoofs. "Because I'm sorrowful," said the old gander. "I made a bad mistake after leaving you." "Tell me about it," said Puss, and got down from his pony and tickled the poor miserable gander under his chin. But even then he wouldn't smile. "Well, you see, I wandered upstairs, and just as I was standing outside my master's door, somebody took me by the left leg and threw me downstairs. Were you ever thrown downstairs, Sir Cat?" And the poor old gander looked at Puss as much as to say it was an awful thing to have happened to one. "Yes, I was," replied the little traveler. "Cinderella's cruel sisters once knocked me down their cellar stairs and shut me up in the cellar. That was even worse than what happened to you, for I didn't get out for a long time, and my, oh my, it was dark in that damp cellar." When the old gander heard this, he brightened up a bit. "Yes," went on Puss, seeing he was making the old gander feel better by talking about himself, "I would still be there, I think, if Cinderella hadn't opened the cellar door." End of chapter 15.